Be here today. I am honored to be in such a great state and to be on the Snyder-Kelly team. These are two men who love this state and truly have the best interest of Michigan and the future of Michigan. They want to build a very strong foundation going forward. It's been a treat going through this process with such a talented team of individuals, not just within the governor's office, but the cabinet that we've been working with very closely, as well as my staff, dedicated staff in the budget office. It's truly been an opportunity for me, a great opportunity. The budget that we put before you and present to you today is a balanced budget, and it really builds a strong foundation for moving Michigan forward in the future. I'd like to start, I think each of you have a copy of my presentation. I'm going to talk through this rather quickly because I want to make sure there's adequate time for questions. I know many of you have. But I do want to make sure that you're aware that we are always available. I'm happy to come meet with you one-on-one. I'm happy to have you meet with our staff. We'll be following up in committees. The agencies will be there to go through the detail. There's a lot of detail behind this budget. It's the culmination of hundreds of hours of preparation and analysis that we present before you. I will tell you it is a responsible budget that balances the needs of our citizens here in Michigan and the taxpayers' ability to pay for them. With that, I'd like to start by talking about our focus in putting this budget together. I wanted to find the budget gap that we set about to solve. I also want to talk about the structural deficit and explain why that's so important to the long-term well-being of this great state. I want to talk about key budget adjustments in particular areas that may be of interest, that will be of interest. I also want to talk about the critical areas and some good news at the end. And I certainly want to leave time for questions and answers. First of all, our focus was to put an end to crisis management. For the last decade, it's been difficult to get to other vitally important policy decisions because we've always been in a crisis dealing with the budget. Michigan never came out of the 2002 downturn like most of the states did, and therefore the budget's always been the difficulty that you've been dealing with as policymakers. We put before you, as the governor mentioned, a two-year spending plan. It was a very good exercise doing a two-year budget because we knew what decisions that we were making today and how they impacted tomorrow, or 2013. We had to make particular adjustments in the 2012 budget to balance the 2013 budget. It was a great opportunity, a great exercise. We want to look at the long-term fiscal solvency of the state, build a strong financial base to build on. We wanted to look at program-specific adjustments. We didn't just want to go across and say, here's the gap, we're going to do an across-the-board cut, here's your cuts agencies, go implement them. We wanted to make sure that what we were proposing to reduce was defensible, was well thought out, and would have as minimal amount of impact on the people we're here to serve as possible. That's not to say that there weren't very difficult decisions that we had to make. They weighed on us very heavily, but we knew that we had to get to this balanced budget at the end of the day. We're putting forth two omnibus budgets in front of us. There's a general government bill and there's a school funding bill, which includes really preschool funding up through our university system. We think that that will help bring everything together in a consolidated way so we can look at policies in each area and put them in relationship with other areas of the budget that we need to fund. We went through that exercise. It was a very good exercise for us to go through on the executive branch, and we look forward to working through it with you on the legislative side. This budget, as the governor also mentioned, has performance metrics tied to it. We are submitting with the budget specific performance metrics tied to each line item that we're proposing. There's a quality metric, there's an efficiency metric, and there's an effectiveness metric. And this is a way that you as policymakers and we from the executive leadership can make sure that the agencies are delivering the programs and policies that you set out through your legislative duties. This is a beginning step on these metrics. We want to work with you. We want to encourage you as your subcommittees to go in and work with the agencies on developing these metrics so we are really capturing what's important to you as policymakers, because we certainly understand that you set the budget and set the policy for the state, and we go ahead and execute that policy. We want to make sure that we're accountable back to the legislature. We want to make sure that we're delivering the services as you had intended them to be delivered. The basis of all of this is to build a strong foundation, as the Governor's mentioned, for the reinvention of Michigan. Getting into the budget gap, let me start by quickly talking about the current budget year, fiscal year 2011. The good news is the budget is still in balance. In fact, as of the last revenue forecast, we're looking at a projected $300 million surplus in the current budget year. We did not spend that in this budget because it's one-time money. We were very interested in bringing the budget into structural balance. That means our ongoing revenues match our ongoing expenditures. As individuals, we would never want to pay our mortgage on our credit card or pay our mortgage out of our savings account. We'd want to make sure that we had the recurring salaries or monthly income to make that mortgage payment. We feel very strongly that this is a key principle that the state of Michigan needs to do and follow. We set that $300 million aside knowing that there are certain spending risks in the current fiscal year. We know that there's federal unemployment insurance interest that we have to pay on the $3.7 billion worth of debt the Governor referred to. We also know that there are certain risks with certain Medicaid disallowances from the federal government. And we know that there are some other spending pressures. So we've set that aside as kind of an insurance policy against those risks. But if those aren't sufficient and we see some changes in the current fiscal year, be assured that we will be with you very promptly to solve the current fiscal year. But the good news is as of today, fiscal year 11 is still in balance. One thing to note is that in the current year budget, we have 14% of one-time money. This primarily comes from the federal stimulus money as well as other programs that the state has done and other one-time funding sources. We wanted to solve that problem, pull the one-time money out, and bring spending in line with our ongoing baseline revenues. The 2012 budget projected gap in the general fund is at $1.4 billion. The contributors to this gap are primarily what I just mentioned with the loss of one-time federal stimulus money. But there's also a piece of the long-term structural imbalance that's plagued this state for the last decade or longer. We also have spending pressures. Just because we have a loss of revenue, we have increases in our Medicaid caseload and utilization. We also have increases in our employee benefits that we need to fund. We have a lot of different pressures that we're dealing with that have to be factored into that budget gap. The next slide, if you're following along, is a chart that shows how we came up with that gap. I will not take a lot of time going through that, but you can see the two funds, the general fund and the school aid fund, and the gaps associated with each. We went about solving this gap with a couple of things that we wanted to do. As the Governor mentioned, we wanted to bring the spending in line without any gimmicks or general tax increases. Aside from the tax restructuring that we've done to really put Michigan in a strong position from the tax policy side, we didn't feel that it was right to increase taxes to help solve the deficit that we're incurring as a state. We thought that it was important to reduce spending in the best way that we could. So the budget that we put before you today includes over $1.5 billion in reduced spending. We also have some structural reforms. We have the tax shift, as the Governor mentioned to you, on the Medicaid HMO side. But by and large, we balance this budget through expenditure reductions. We also, in many areas of the budget, as the Governor mentioned, one with local revenue sharing, we've put in best practices for accountability, best practices of accountability within particular pieces of the budget that I'll talk about as we go forward. I'd like to now turn the time into key areas and talk about the budget adjustments that we made. First, I'd like to start with education. Just to put into perspective, as many of you know, if you look at the available tax revenue that we bring in as a state, over 60% of that revenue goes into the school aid fund. And it's very difficult when you have such a drop in revenues as we've had as a state, it's very difficult to hold that piece harmless. And as a policy team on the executive branch side, we've taken the position that we need to start looking at education in this state as an entire system, pre-K through our universities. And certainly where the budget that we're proposing follows that pattern when it comes to the school aid fund. We are targeting a 5% reduction, a 4.9% reduction in the K-12 budget. It reduces the school foundation grants by $300, which is in addition to the $170 that the legislature passed last year or the year before. We also have eliminated, the total of this is about $452 million. We are also reducing some of the past earmarks that have gone into the school aid funding that are no longer really, we feel that no longer really meet their intended purpose when they were set up. Now, to put this into perspective, I want you to know, as the governor mentioned, we didn't just pull numbers out of the air. We thought through these numbers. If all of the school districts were to go to an 80-20 split on their health care contributions, that would generate $300 million. Put them well over half of meeting this targeted reduction. If they were to reduce their non-instructional line item by just 10% through implementing best practices and looking for efficiencies, it would generate over another $300 million in savings. So we feel that this is a very defensible plan that doesn't have to impact the classroom, because we know that that's the critical area that we need to maintain in school aid funding. Turning to higher education, we have some of the best higher educations. By the way, on a personal note, I will tell you the education system here in Michigan is one of the best. In fact, I was excited to come for the job opportunity. My wife, with our 6 children, was excited to come for the educational opportunity. So she's delighted to be putting our children in the education system here in Michigan. Turning to higher education, we have some of the best universities in the country. We have some of the best and brightest people attending these universities. We are looking at a reduction in higher education budget of 15%. Now, this is a larger reduction than we would have liked to have done, but looking at where we were going as a policy team and getting the spending into control, we knew that we needed to do this. The good news is, and the silver lining, as I've talked with many university presidents, is that we're going to get out of the year after year after year cut. We're going to make this reduction, and then we're going to be done based upon this budget that we're presenting to you today. As an incentive to not have the higher education institutions just automatically increase tuition by 15%, we have actually come up with a tuition incentive fund, which we basically looked at all of the institutions, looked at their 5-year average tuition increase, and set that money aside in a separate line item that we'll be presenting to you. We've put language in the bill that says that if the universities can demonstrate that their tuition increase is less than the statewide 5-year average, that money will be released to them. So that provides an incentive to make sure that we're keeping the tuition increases affordable for our students who are relying upon that education and lower tuition costs. This also provides an incentive for our universities to look internally, just like state government and others are doing, to bring down expenditures and to reduce expenditures. As far as community colleges are concerned, we've recommended flat funding for community colleges. They've taken a big hit on the property tax that they can't recover, and they've been very judicious about their tuition increases, and their caseloads are just through the roof, with people going back to retrain due to a difficult economy. Turning to health care, we have a lot of citizens here in Michigan who really need a safety net at this time. And looking at the Medicaid budget of $12 billion, we wanted to preserve as much of that as we can. Now, that doesn't mean that we didn't cut in this area. We did cut pretty significantly. But by incorporating this broad-based insurance claims tax that the governor mentioned, we were able to preserve $780 million of federal Medicaid money to protect our health care system. So we will not be reducing provider rates as many states are doing. And that's good news, because that is an access issue. And we certainly want to make sure that we are protecting those who are the most vulnerable among us. In the area of human services, we are recommending the big policy change there as an administration. We are recommending a 48-month lifetime limit in the Family Independence Program. We feel comfortable doing this because this is a program, the federal lifetime limit is 60 months. When they block granted the TANF grant to the states back in 1997, they allowed states to determine if they wanted to have a more restrictive time limit. Most states range from 24 months to up to 60 months. There are states all over the map on this. But the key here is that within the Family Independence Program, there is a criteria that the federal government allows us to carry up to 20% of our caseload past those time limits for either disabilities or other hardships as defined by the state. And so we will feel like there's a big enough safety net to be able to reduce this time limit. It will allow us to get the people in, address their barriers, come up with plans, and get them back to work. This will save us about $65 million in general fund. We're also looking at a couple of other opportunities to reduce spending in the Department of Human Services, child care provider rates for relative care or other unlicensed caregivers. We're looking at reducing the rate from $1.60 an hour to $1.35 an hour, which will generate about $13 million. There are also some other areas as far as treatment facilities that the department's come forward with and said that we think that we can better manage our populations, and so we'll be able to reduce an adolescent holding center and be able to shift the individuals into other places where we have capacity within the system. An area that we're actually adding money in the Department of Human Services is in the area of child welfare reform. We know that this is a critical area to keep investing in. We're putting $69 million into this area. This will build upon prior year funding to bring it to a total of $273 million in anticipating caseload growth and other critical areas within critical programs within this area. Now I'd like to turn to public safety. Public safety is always a concern to the citizens of any state, especially here in Michigan. There's been a lot of talk about corrections and corrections budget. In fact, one of the first media questions I had when it was announced I was coming to Michigan was on the corrections budget. So I realized that there were some issues within this budget. When we looked at it, though, as I mentioned earlier, we didn't want to do any knee-jerk reaction, knee-jerk cuts. We wanted to make sure that the cuts were fully thought out and fully analyzed and implemented in a way that didn't jeopardize public safety. Having said that, we do feel that there's about $51 million in direct spending that we can reduce in the corrections budget. We are proposing the closing of a prison facility. This will save approximately $19 million. We'll close it later this fall. We have not decided when or which facility to close. That will be determined later. But we know that with the declining caseload in the corrections population, we'll be able to reduce a facility and take a facility offline, which will save us money. We're also looking at competitively bidding the food service operations and prison store operations within the system. There are other supply chain transformations that we're looking at that will generate a savings of $32 million. This is just the beginning. We will systematically look at this department, as we will with all departments. Even though the budget is imbalanced, we will, as the governor mentioned, we're going to be operating for results and value for money. And so we will keep the pressure on and looking at each of these departments. And the cabinet members have been given that directive, and they're very willing to support us in that effort. Turning to state police, the new colonel in the state police department came to us with their thoughts on how they could reduce the budget. Again, these aren't real pretty reductions in any of these areas, but in looking at how we can do things better, they thought that they could reduce the number of police posts throughout the state. We haven't targeted a specific number, but they felt that they could re-engineer the process and save approximately $3.2 million. This is doable because nowadays, with technology, if you've been in a police cruiser lately, hopefully none of you have involuntarily, but if you have been in a police cruiser, they all have cell phones, laptops, even printers right there in the cruisers. And they think that by eliminating some of these posts, we won't have to have officers in manning the posts. They can be out on the road keeping the public safe. There are also some other reductions within the Department of Public Safety that they're looking at for a total of about $17.5 million. We know that it can't all be about reductions. We know that with the elimination of tax credits, we need to make sure that we are investing in economic development. And as a result, we have set aside funding for that area. The budget provides about $130 million, for investment in critical economic development areas. 75 of that's coming from the 21st Century Jobs Fund. The governor, as he mentioned in his State of the State, wants to put $25 million into Pure Michigan, $25 million into business attraction and economic gardening, and $25 million into innovation and entrepreneurship. In addition to that, we have allocated $50 million in general fund, 25 additional dollars to go into business attraction, economic gardening, and $25 million to go into the film incentive program. We will not be having that credit anymore, although we will be carrying forward on the credits and making good on the credits that have already been awarded. We didn't want to shut the program off, so we are recommending $25 million go in to allow that industry to keep going. Turning to state employee compensation, I want to say that we have great state employees here in the state of Michigan. I've got some of the best in the budget office, and I know in each of the agencies, all of the people that I've talked to and dealt with, I've been very impressed. We have, though, looking at the budget and doing some analysis on the budget, I know there's a lot of frustration when it comes to state employee compensation, and the policymakers keep wanting to attack the compensation of state employees. But when you look at state government and you look at the allocation of dollars that are spent, the vast majority go to personnel and personnel costs. In fact, it's important to note that over the past decade, our general fund growth in Michigan has been flat, zero. We've had some increases in years, others, most of them have been below zero. But when you look at state employee compensation, in the last 10 years, the state's contribution to employee health insurance has doubled. Average compensation or average wages have increased for state employees by over 28%. Now, this isn't to say that it's not important to reward the state employees, but I just want to make a point that it's very difficult to deal with these increasing costs with little or no revenue growth. And I think it's important for people to understand that we're not wanting to come after state employees for the hard and good work that they do, but we just want them to understand the realities that you as policymakers are dealing with. The pie is only so big. And when you have double-digit increases in health insurance costs, and when you have market losses in the pension side that you have to make up, there's only so much funding. And so as you look at employee compensation, it creates pressures and requires us to go in and look at wage compensation reductions. Now, we have built into the budget $180 million for employee concessions. This $180 million will obviously need to be negotiated, but I want to let you know that we didn't just, again, pull a number out of the air. There are some targeted reductions that we need to fill in particular agencies when it comes to employee concessions as contracts are negotiated independently. But by and large, when you look at just the health care contributions, just like the education community, by taking all state employees to an 80-20 split on the health care premiums, you can make up half of this concession. In addition, we did a lot of homework working with experts throughout the country, comparing Michigan's benefit plan to that of other states, not just the private sector, but other states, localities, etc. And we have identified areas that we feel that we can hit these targets comfortably. But again, it'll have to be negotiated, and how it's realized and determined will depend upon those negotiations. But it is a number that we think that we can defend, and given the increasing area in this, the increasing costs in this area, it's important to get a hold of these benefit increases so we can begin to look at total compensation of a state, and you as policymakers can determine where do we want to be when it comes to employee compensation. And we from the executive branch look forward to teaming with you to that end. The governor talked about the long-term OPEB liability. I think that's very significant. And I think that that's something that this budget does that I personally am very proud of. There are very few states funding that OPEB liability. I'm not going to talk about revenue sharing. I think that the governor did a fine job talking about that. There's a slide on that. But I just want to end with a couple general comments, Mr. Chairman, before we take questions. I want people to realize that as a state government, this budget still spends $45.9 billion. It's still a big budget. It's 98% of what the fiscal year 2011 budget is. Okay, it's real easy to focus on the hardships, the cuts, the reductions. A lot of people are going to be upset with this budget. We understand that. But it's the right budget. It's a responsible budget taking into account the needs of our citizens and the taxpayers' ability to pay. I will tell you, I do have quite a bit of experience in the budgeting world. I know all of the other budget directors out throughout the country. I spend a lot of time talking with them. And I can look you in the eye and tell you that if the state enacts this budget, or a budget that's based on these principles and foundations, this will put Michigan in one of the strongest financial positions in the country. There's a lot to be said about that. Wall Street is already taking note. In fact, I've been on the phone with some of the rating agency folks who deal with state ratings, and they've said it looks like Michigan's up to good things. In today's Wall Street Journal, we have our great, highly esteemed governor with the headline saying, "Lasting budget fix sought in Michigan." This is big stuff that we're about to do here, and we want to work together hand in hand with you to accomplish this great task, because I know that by doing so we'll be able to build a strong foundation that will set this state apart from all of the others and really provide a benefit and a future for our great state. With that, Mr. Chairman, we'll turn to questions.
Thank you both for your presentations. We are going to have a series of questions for you. First, Chairman Brandenburg.
I'm fine for right now.
Senator Anderson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Nixon, I know your proposal that you've outlined for revenue sharing, the cut in revenue sharing, and you're saying there's 29% of the current cities, villages, and townships that receive the $92.1 million. Many of our cities and our communities, townships, are, as you know, are on the verge of insolvency already. Police and fire reductions have been made to such a degree that response times have increased substantially, and the number of personnel has dwindled. What would you say to our citizens that will not be able to have police and fire respond to their requests for aid, for our students that do not have a school district that can afford to educate them based on some of the cuts that have been proposed?
You know, I certainly think that those are pretty dramatic things that you just referred to. I certainly don't think that our budget imposes those types of inflictions on the locals. We're very aware of what's going on locally. We had great discussions about that. But it all comes down to best practices. The things that we're doing and showing and setting the lead and the example on as a state government here with this budget, if the counties and the local municipalities follow suit, they will more than offset the reduction that we're passing along to them.
Mr. Chair, if I could just clarify, we do have some districts that are already on the verge of insolvency. This will push them over the edge. That's all.
Thank you, Senator Anderson. Chairman Moss.
Thank you. I think we're taking these two by two, and just in order that I got them. Representative Horn.
And through the chairs to Lieutenant Governor and to Mr. Nixon, thank you so much for the presentation. I got to tell you, I am so frustrated and sick and tired of being dead last in the state, and it's refreshing to have some, hope for very near future to be on the top of this, the feeding chart. My concern generates from my energy committee, from the House Energy Committee, and one of our goals is to make Michigan a great place to do business. And it's my thought that we as a state really need to fall in love with manufacturing again. We need to build power plants, we need to build cars, we need to forge steel, and with the elimination of the credits. In the MBT is where I'm heading, Lieutenant Governor. Any thought given to the removal of the personal property tax credit inside that MBT puts kind of an unfair burden on our manufacturing sector because of the heavy cost of personal property, the equipment they have to buy, the investments they have to make. If we're going to wait with the personal property tax to deal with that issue sometime in the future, is it fair to the auto sector, for example, to apply both a corporate income tax and a personal property tax? Has any thought been given into rolling the PPT right into the corporate income tax, even if it means bumping that number up a little bit?
We do recognize and agree that the personal property tax is an issue. I'd make one point to say that the majority of the personal property tax relief granted in 2007 through the passage of the Michigan Business Tax and the accompanying changes in the General Property Tax Act are being maintained with this, and that is the exemption of the mills that went to the state. All of the mills that went for industrial property and half of the mills that went for commercial. This proposal doesn't change that. That reduction stays in place. There was an additional credit, a refundable credit on top of that millage reduction in 2007 placed on the Michigan Business Tax. But our position on that is that the personal property tax is a problem, and by simply offering a credit to subsidize that problem doesn't actually fix anything. It basically just spreads the problem over more taxpayers. And instead, we'd rather attack the problem at its root and say the personal property tax, it's a type of taxation that is very self-defeating and that we need to be committed to eliminating. And I look forward to working with you on that. Given the fact that this, when we talk about being in a competitive position when it comes to the corporate income tax rate, I don't think that we have much room. There's a lot of states that are a little bit ahead of us or a little bit higher than what we're proposing, and it doesn't take too much to get taken out. The other point, to make us uncompetitive again, the other point that I would make, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that those same entities that make stuff in Michigan and sell it all over the world, including our biggest trade partner, Canada, need another bridge. Sorry, Mr. Chairman.
Well, you're the one who said you wouldn't set off any atomic devices. And for that one, we're going to call you Duke Nukem. Representative Lipton. Representative Meadows, give her the mic.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My question is directed primarily to the portion of the budget pertaining to economic development. And certainly the notion of simplifying the tax code makes intuitive sense. My question, though, is in the elimination of many of the credits, was thought given to the economic reality of businesses and states competing and using tax credits as a vehicle for attracting businesses and sometimes cannibalizing businesses from one state to the next?
Yes, I appreciate that question. It's really, the crux of the issue is how can Michigan be competitive? And oftentimes our reliance and our mindset, and I hope that we can change this mindset. Our mindset in Michigan for a long time has been, we're uncompetitive. Why would anybody ever want to be here? And therefore, we need to buy business in. And so this mindset that we have to provide some sort of a subsidy in order to convince somebody to be here is one that's rooted in the uncompetitiveness of the system across the board. And so what we want to do is make the system across the board more competitive, more conducive to job growth for the companies that are already in this state, for the entrepreneurs and the innovators that are located in Michigan that have ideas, good ideas, to grow and expand their businesses right here. And they will if the environment is right. And so that's what we are looking to accomplish is a system that grows jobs from within. It's this idea of economic gardening, as opposed to trying to essentially bribe companies to come here with credits. We're talking about an overall system that works well for everybody, and we think that most industries will take notice of that and say we want to be in a place that's competitive, and that implements a system that's simple, fair, and efficient.
Senator Prose.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate it, Lieutenant Governor Calley and Mr. Nixon. Thank you for the presentation today. The governor, I think if I quoted him correctly, said with the tax changes that we're envisioning, we'd be among the most competitive in the nation on the business tax side of the ledger. Remind me of the analysis that exists out there today, and either one of the two of you can please answer this. The first is, where are we today on that business tax competitiveness structure amongst the 50 states, and where do you envision with this change we would end up at the end of the day that would give us that top headline in the Wall Street Journal that says Michigan is in fact open for business?
Well, I'd point out there's several different ways of measuring this, and there's several, and we've looked at different measurements or those that we could actually get into the calculations to determine where we would end up. A couple of the more popular had taken us from very uncompetitive positions into the 20s, or I saw another one said 16th as well. But keep in mind those calculations are not just the business tax. It's the personal property tax that Representative Horn had talked about earlier. It's our unemployment insurance costs in this state as well. And so when you take all these pieces, we think that the business tax component, this puts us right there, and it's just an awesome position. But we won't be a top 10 state until we fix other things as well. And it's important that we be committed to fixing those other areas, including the regulatory environment. And I want to take this opportunity to thank both the House and the Senate for the pace of work that you're doing on fixing the regulatory environment in our state as well.
Senator Boer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, I too thank our Lieutenant Governor and our Budget Director for being here in that presentation. To Lieutenant Governor Brian Calley, the 50,000 C Corps that will end up paying a tax out of the numbers that you described here, roughly 50,000 will still paid. Will they have an option to stay with BT tax, or do they just go to the 6%?
Everybody would move to the 6%. The decision that we have to make is how do we want to honor those certificated credits or those certified credits that have already been awarded. They've been awarded against the MBT. And so we could transfer those credits over to the new business tax and apply them there, or we could require those entities to file under the Michigan business tax and apply them to that liability and continue to pay that until their credits run out. Or you could just handle a direct appropriation year by year to do them as well. There's several ways that you could handle doing that, and we would look forward to working with the tax policy committees and finance policy committee as well to determining what is the best route going forward.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chairman Moss.
Representative Townsend.
I can.
Why don't you go on up to the, just go up to the podium, okay?
Lieutenant Governor and Budget Director, I appreciate your excellent presentations. And I'm glad to hear the Governor talk about the idea of a lasting budget fix and putting our state on a pay-as-you-go basis. I am concerned, though, that the legislation we're considering to strengthen the Emergency Financial Manager Act creates a bit of a double standard. We're on the one hand saying to state and to local government and school districts that if they don't balance their budgets, we're going to take them over. And we, as a state, have not been on a long-term pay-as-you-go basis ever. So I'm wondering if you would be supportive, if the governor would be supportive of putting the legislature on a 5-year pay-as-you-go basis. In other words, tax cuts or spending increases or policy changes that increase our liabilities would have to be offset by adjoining legislation that would reduce spending, increase revenues to offset that deficit that we're creating. Thank you.
I think philosophically, we're there with you. That's the reason why we wanted the tax policy committees and the appropriations committees to meet jointly for this presentation. It's because when you make an appropriations decision, it will eventually have a tax policy ramification to it. And when you make tax policy decisions, it will have a budgetary ramification to it as well. And so I think it is very important that that we do act responsibly in that fashion. I believe that this budget does accomplish that. It is true that the state has taken the easy way out in the past. And if this budget is enacted, it will be the end of that practice for the state, and I believe that we will be a good role model for other entities within the state and other states around the country.
I appreciate that very much. I just would point out that this was done at the federal level in the 90s under a Republican and Democratic administrations, and we eliminated the federal budget deficit during that period. And I think if we're going to do and impose this sort of thing on local government and on school districts, we should be willing to do the same thing for ourselves.
Thank you. Representative Meadows.
Well, it's a good thing this was left on. Well, if I can do two things, Mr. Chairman. First, I want to give a shout out to the LG because I have a feeling that he was very instrumental in having $200 million moved into, I assume, the Healthcare Trust Fund so that we can start to prepay on our OPEB obligations as we go on. He was on the Healthcare Retirement Reform Committee, as you were, in the first session we were in. And the reforms that came out of there, I hope you'll be arguing with the governor to get those done as well, because those haven't been done. My second comment is that much of what you've said today are things that we actually discussed in 2007. And I know the LG was in some meetings with us where we talked about the elimination of some expenditures or the suspension of them in order to deal with the budget crisis at that time. Unfortunately, we weren't able to convince many Republicans to support us on that, so I hope you're more successful at that than we were in 2007. I have a specific question regarding public pensions, simply because, again, we looked at this in 2007 and actually have looked at it in 2009 as well. Our research indicated that, based on an Attorney General opinion that we had, that we could only do this going forward, that we could tax public pensions as we went forward, but basically our Constitution told us we couldn't impose a tax on public pensions that were already in existence. And I'm wondering whether the budget reflects this, or you've received other legal advice that would allow us to impose a tax on current public pensions.
Yeah, we do disagree with the conclusion of the Attorney General opinion from the early 90s. And it's on a couple different bases, but I think the main strength to the proposal that we're making today is the decision of the Studier case as it pertained to other post-retirement benefits and or post-employment benefits. You have to make the determination that the benefit itself is an accrued financial benefit. And the decision in the Studier case was that that health care, in fact, was not an accrued financial benefit. And it's very difficult to understand how one would conclude that a tax exemption is an accrued financial benefit. Also, within the same article of the Constitution, Article 9, that has the protection for accrued financial benefits within the pension system. There's also another section that indicates that Michigan does not surrender its ability to taxation under any circumstances. It's a conflicting provision within the same section of the Constitution to that decision, and we don't believe it would hold up.
Senator Jansen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think this is a historic day. I want to thank the governor and his team for presenting what I think is a serious proposal and a difficult proposal, but I'm looking forward to the work ahead of us because this has been a long time coming. I have lots of questions. I'm just going to ask one, and that is probably for the Lieutenant Governor. Have you done any modeling on the numbers of jobs that in 2 years we're going to be looking at? Because these are big changes, structural fixes, which is exactly where we need to be. But at the end of the day, we all ran on, we need more jobs. And so have you modeled that underneath this? And if you haven't, let's go. Anyway, so.
Dynamic modeling, I don't think would be appropriate for inclusion in our budget, simply the way that our budget process works. That, you know, we take current situations and apply the numbers to them. Now, it's difficult to put together a model that isolates the impact of just a taxation change because there are so many other factors involved in this process. I have in the past, not under this particular plan, but sought out help from some of the university experts in terms of creating a dynamic model that say make this change in taxation, you're likely to see this type of job growth. And the number of assumptions that were required to make any sort of a determination were such that I didn't want to put us in a position to rely on a study of that nature for budgeting purposes. So we've been specifically conservative with respect to how the tax plan itself would impact the budget, and not assuming any dynamic growth as you have talked about. But going forward, I'd look forward to working with the Finance Committee and the Tax Policy Committee in determining what the parameters of that dynamic modeling should be in order to make the sort of predictions that you're looking for. I know in looking at how we compare to other states that it makes us very, very competitive. But to take it beyond that, I think that we'd really need to work together on what the assumptions would be that we'd want to make to put the assumptions in, or to put